They wanted to figure you out. Cute. So they brought in experts, analysts, people with degrees, notebooks, serious expressions, and enough confidence to believe every human being can be reduced to a neat little explanation. They watched how you reacted, how you handled pressure, how you stayed quiet when everyone expected you to explode, how you kept moving when circumstances gave you every excuse to quit. They searched for the weakness, the predictable pattern, the little button they could press, and suddenly understand everything about you. But here's the problem with trying to profile someone who keeps evolving. Yesterday's version isn't today's version. You learned. You adapted. You stopped giving people the same reactions they used to depend on. And now they're confused because the old formulas aren't working anymore. Maybe there isn't some mysterious diagnosis hiding underneath it all. Maybe you're simply a person who became more self-aware, more disciplined, and less interested in performing for other people's expectations. That's what really bothers people. They want certainty. They want labels. They want to put you inside a box and feel comfortable knowing exactly what you'll do next. But you don't owe anyone that comfort. You can be calm without being weak. You can be intense without being unstable. You can be private without being suspicious. You can change your mind without being inconsistent. Human beings are complicated, and sometimes the most honest explanation is simply that you're still becoming. So if someone studies you and decides they have you completely figured out, smile and keep living. Let your actions remain unpredictable only because you're growing, not because you're trying to confuse anyone. You don't need to prove that you're impossible to understand. You only need to refuse to let someone else's label become your identity, while every old assumption they made about you slowly becomes outdated the moment you take another step forward. Another decision, another lesson, another version of yourself they never bothered to imagine, leaving them with questions you don't need to answer. Because your life isn't a psychological puzzle designed for their entertainment. It's yours to live, change, build, and redefine. Whenever you discover something new about yourself, people love labels, because labels make complicated things feel simple. They see one decision, one reaction, one mistake, one strange habit, and suddenly they think they've solved the entire puzzle. Congratulations, you've been reduced to a sentence. They want to know what kind of person you are, what makes you angry, what makes you afraid, what makes you confident, and exactly how you'll react when pressure arrives. It's comforting for them. Predictability makes people feel safe, but you don't have to fit inside the box they built for you. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to outgrow old habits, question old beliefs, and become someone that yesterday's version of you wouldn't even recognize. That's what makes labels dangerous when you start believing them yourself. Someone calls you weak, and eventually you start behaving as though weakness is your identity. Someone calls you difficult, and you begin apologizing for having boundaries. Someone says you're too quiet, too intense, too ambitious, too emotional, too independent, and suddenly you're spending your life adjusting yourself so other people can feel comfortable around you. What a strange way to live, becoming smaller just to make someone else's opinion easier to maintain. You don't need to do that. A label is an observation at best, not a permanent sentence. Maybe you were impatient once. That doesn't mean you're permanently impatient. Maybe you failed. That doesn't mean you're a failure. Maybe you trusted the wrong person. That doesn't mean you're incapable of trusting wisely again. Maybe you spent years distracted and unfocused. That doesn't mean your future has to resemble your past. Human beings aren't statues. You're allowed to move. You're allowed to evolve. And when you do, people who were comfortable with the old version of you may become confused. They'll say, "You're different now." Of course you are. That's the point. Imagine going through years of experience and somehow remaining exactly the same. That would be the strange thing. Growth should make some old descriptions inaccurate. Your boundaries may become stronger. Your priorities may change. Your reactions may become calmer. Your standards may become higher. Your circle may become smaller. None of that automatically makes you arrogant or cold. Sometimes it simply means you've learned. You don't need to explain every transformation to everyone who remembers who you used to be. They can update their understanding when they're ready. And if they refuse, that's fine too. Their outdated opinion doesn't become your responsibility. You don't need to spend your energy arguing with someone about a version of yourself that no longer exists. Let them remember the old you. Let them tell their stories. Let them keep their assumptions. Meanwhile, you keep building, keep learning, keep becoming. The strongest identity isn't the one that never changes. It's the one that can change without completely losing its values. You can become more confident without becoming arrogant, more cautious without becoming paranoid, more independent without becoming isolated, more disciplined without becoming rigid, more ambitious without becoming obsessed. That's real growth. Not becoming somebody else, but becoming more intentional about who you already have the potential to be. And when people can't categorize you anymore, don't panic. You don't owe anyone a convenient explanation. You don't need to be easily understood to be authentic. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is allow people to be uncertain about you while you remain certain about the direction you're choosing, because your life isn't a box waiting for someone else's label. And the moment you stop trying to fit their description, you finally have enough space to become the person their description was never capable of predicting, moving forward without carrying every old judgment, like a name tag you were forced to wear forever, letting your choices speak louder than their assumptions, while you continue changing in ways that make yesterday's version of you impossible to use as a map for where you're going next. The funniest thing about growth is that people often expect you to remain predictable just because they knew you before. They remember how you reacted years ago, what scared you, what made you angry, what you tolerated, what you chased, and they quietly build a little mental file labeled, "This is who you are." Then you change, and suddenly they look at you like you've broken some invisible contract. You're different now? Yes. That's usually what happens when life teaches you something. You don't go through rejection, failure, disappointment, responsibility, and experience just to remain exactly the same person afterward. You evolve, you adapt. You learn which battles are worth fighting and which ones are just expensive distractions. Maybe you used to explain yourself to everyone. Now you don't. Maybe you used to chase people who walked away. Now you let them walk. Maybe you used to react instantly when someone provoked you. Now you pause. Maybe you used to spend every night worrying about what people thought. Now you have things to build that are more important than their opinions. That's not some mysterious transformation. That's growth. And growth can make you difficult for people to predict because you're no longer operating from the same emotional habits. The old button doesn't always work anymore. The old insult doesn't automatically create the old reaction. The old manipulation doesn't produce the old desperation. You learn the pattern. Once you recognize a pattern, it becomes much harder for someone to control you with it. But here's the important part. Don't become obsessed with being unpredictable just to confuse people. That's not growth. That's another performance. You don't need to act mysterious. You don't need to hide your intentions. You don't need to play psychological games. Just become more conscious of your choices. That's enough. Real evolution is quiet. You wake up and realize you don't want the same things anymore. You discover that certain environments exhaust you. You notice that certain conversations always lead nowhere. You recognize that some goals were inherited from other people's expectations rather than chosen by you. And slowly, you start making different decisions. That's how identity changes. Not through one dramatic announcement, but through hundreds of small choices nobody notices. You say no more often. You protect your mornings. You spend less time explaining. You work when nobody is watching. You stop arguing with people who only want reactions. You begin choosing long-term peace over short-term approval. Then one day someone who hasn't seen you in a while looks at you and says, "What happened to you?" Nothing happened. Everything happened. Experience happened. Consequences happened. Awareness happened. You finally paid attention to the lessons life kept repeating. And maybe some people won't like the new version because the old version was easier for them to understand or influence. That's okay. Your growth doesn't require unanimous approval. You don't need to return to an old identity just because someone misses the version of you they could predict. Let them miss it. You don't owe the past a reunion. Your responsibility is to keep becoming someone you respect. That means accepting that growth can be uncomfortable even for you. Sometimes you'll outgrow habits before you understand what replaces them. Sometimes you'll lose relationships because your priorities changed. Sometimes you'll feel like you're between identities, no longer comfortable as the old you but not fully confident as the new you. That's normal. Becoming takes time. You don't need to have the entire transformation figured out before you begin. Keep learning. Keep adjusting. Keep observing yourself honestly. If something isn't working, change it. If something is helping, strengthen it. If a belief no longer makes sense, question it. Your mind isn't a museum where every old idea must remain untouched forever. And while other people are still trying to understand the version of you they met years ago, you can quietly continue becoming someone shaped by experience rather than trapped by history, allowing every lesson to update the way you think, respond, choose, and move forward without needing to announce every change to anyone who isn't walking the same road with you. Because the most powerful evolution isn't becoming unrecognizable to everyone else. It's becoming more recognizable to yourself. More honest about what you want, more disciplined about what you do, and more willing to leave behind anything that no longer belongs in the life you're building now. They used to know exactly which button to press, didn't they? One comment, one look, one message, and suddenly you were reacting before you even realized what happened. They knew what made you angry, what made you insecure, what made you desperate to explain yourself. And because they knew your reactions, they thought they knew you. That's the funny part. They didn't know you. They knew your triggers. There's a difference. Real strength begins when you stop allowing every emotion to become an instruction. Someone insults you, and instead of immediately firing back, you pause. Someone ignores you, and instead of chasing them for an explanation, you continue with your day. Someone questions your worth, and instead of writing a 5-page defense, you remember that your value isn't something another person gets to vote on. That doesn't mean you become emotionless. That's not strength. You still feel anger. You still feel disappointment. You still feel fear. You still have moments when something gets under your skin. You're human. The difference is that you don't automatically hand your emotions the steering wheel. You can feel something without acting on it immediately. That's emotional discipline, and it changes everything. Because when you stop reacting automatically, people lose their ability to control the direction of your behavior. The person who used to provoke you suddenly doesn't know what to do when you simply look at the situation and decide it's not worth your energy. The person who expected you to chase them becomes confused when you don't. The person who depended on your insecurity realizes you're no longer interested in proving yourself. Suddenly, their old strategies become useless, and you don't have to announce this change. You don't have to say, "Look how emotionally mature I've become." That would be slightly hilarious. Just demonstrate it. Let your behavior speak. There will still be moments when you respond strongly, and that's okay. Boundaries sometimes require directness. Silence isn't always the answer. Walking away isn't always the answer. Sometimes you need to speak clearly and protect yourself. The point isn't avoiding every conflict. The point is choosing your response instead of letting someone else choose it for you. That's a massive difference. You can ask yourself, What outcome do I actually want here? Before you react. Maybe you want resolution. Maybe you want distance. Maybe you want to communicate a boundary. Maybe you realize the conversation isn't worth continuing. Once you know the goal, the emotional noise becomes easier to manage. You stop fighting simply because someone wants a fight. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop trying to win arguments that don't improve your life. And slowly, you become harder to manipulate. Not because you're playing games, but because you're no longer predictable in the way you used to be. Your calmness becomes a choice. Your silence becomes intentional. Your words become more precise. Your attention becomes more valuable because you stop giving it away to every person who knows how to provoke you. That's the real evolution. You aren't becoming colder. You're becoming more deliberate. You're learning that every reaction has consequences and that not every emotion deserves immediate action. You can wait. You can breathe. You can think. You can sleep on it. You can walk away and return when you're calm. You can decide that some things simply don't deserve a response. And when you practice that enough, something changes inside you. You start trusting yourself more because you know you won't abandon your own judgment every time someone pushes the right button. While the people who once believed they could control your mood begin realizing that the old version of you is no longer available for manipulation, no longer desperate to prove, chase, explain, or explode, because you've learned that having emotions doesn't mean being controlled by them, and the strongest response isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to remain yourself when someone else is trying very hard to turn you into somebody you're not, keeping your power by refusing to give your attention away simply because someone discovered how to provoke you, and continuing forward with enough self-control that your reactions belong to you again, rather than to whoever happens to press the right button at the wrong moment. Self-awareness is a strange kind of power, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Nobody hears a soundtrack when you recognize your own patterns. There is no applause when you admit that you were wrong. No fireworks when you finally understand why you keep repeating the same mistake. It's just you, sitting with yourself long enough to stop lying about what you see. And that's where real change begins. You start noticing what triggers you, what drains you, what motivates you, what you avoid, and what you keep pretending doesn't matter. You stop saying, "That's just how I am," every time you encounter a weakness. That's not an identity. That's a habit you've repeated long enough to mistake for personality. Maybe you're impatient. Maybe you overthink. Maybe you seek approval. Maybe you avoid difficult conversations. Maybe you become defensive whenever someone criticizes you. Fine. Notice it. You don't have to hate yourself for having weaknesses. You need enough honesty to recognize them before they start controlling your life. That's what self-awareness gives you: distance. Instead of becoming the emotion, you can observe it. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you can say, "I'm feeling angry right now." That tiny difference gives you room to choose what happens next. You can be anxious without allowing anxiety to make every decision. You can feel insecure without treating the feeling as evidence that you're actually inadequate. You can experience jealousy without turning it into accusations. You can feel rejected without deciding you're unworthy. Emotions are information, not always instructions. That's an important distinction. Your mind will tell you stories. Some will be accurate. Some will be exaggerated. Some will be leftovers from old experiences. You don't have to believe every thought simply because it arrived in your head wearing confidence. Question it. Ask, is this actually true? What evidence do I have? Is there another explanation? Suddenly you become less controlled by automatic thinking. And no, that doesn't mean you become some perfectly logical robot who never makes emotional decisions. You're still human. You will make mistakes. You'll misread situations. You'll occasionally react badly. The difference is what you do afterward. Do you defend the mistake because admitting it hurts your ego? or do you examine it and learn? Do you blame everyone else, or do you ask what part belongs to you? That's maturity. You can take responsibility without taking unnecessary blame. You can say, I handled that badly, without saying, I'm a terrible person. One is accountability. The other is self-destruction. Learn the difference. And the more honestly you understand yourself, the less power other people's labels have over you. Someone can call you arrogant, but you can examine your behavior and decide whether there's something useful in the criticism. Someone can call you selfish, but you can look at your actions instead of automatically accepting or rejecting the label. You don't need to let strangers define you, but you also don't need to become so defensive that you refuse to learn anything from criticism. That's real self-awareness, neither blind acceptance nor blind rejection, but observation. You watch yourself. You learn your patterns. You make adjustments. You become more intentional. And eventually, the person trying to manipulate you has a much harder job because you already understand the buttons they're reaching for. You know your insecurities. You know your fears. You know what makes you defensive. You know when you're tempted to chase approval. You know when you're about to make a decision just to prove something. That knowledge doesn't make you invincible. It makes you harder to deceive, especially by yourself, while you continue learning how your own mind works, recognizing the difference between instinct and impulse, confidence and arrogance, boundaries and isolation, patience and avoidance, and eventually becoming someone who doesn't need to pretend to have no weaknesses because you've become strong enough to face them honestly, work on them deliberately, and refuse to let them quietly run your life from the background, while the person you become is shaped not by pretending you're perfect, but by having the courage to see yourself clearly and still choose to improve again and again, without needing anyone else to diagnose your worth or define your identity for you. And eventually you reach the point where you realize you don't need to prove that you're impossible to understand. That's another trap. You don't need to become mysterious, unpredictable, or complicated just to make other people wonder what you're thinking. The real power is much simpler. You become so committed to your own growth that other people's expectations stop determining your direction. They may expect you to fail, and you keep working. They may expect you to react, and you stay calm. They may expect you to return to an old version of yourself, and you continue forward. They may have a picture of who you are, but you don't have to live inside their picture. That's the beauty of refusing to perform for expectations. You don't need to announce every goal. You don't need to explain every decision. You don't need to tell everyone what you're planning before you've built anything. Sometimes the smartest move is simply doing the work quietly. Let people underestimate you if they want. Let them assume you're not serious. Let them think you're still the person they remember. Their assumptions don't have to become your problem. You're not responsible for managing everyone's expectations of you. You're responsible for managing your own actions. And that's where the focus changes. Instead of asking, what will they think if I do this? You start asking, is this right for the person I'm trying to become? That's a completely different question. It puts your future back in your hands. Maybe the answer is to leave a situation. Maybe it's to start something new. Maybe it's to apologize. Maybe it's to stop apologizing for something that isn't wrong. Maybe it's to become more disciplined. Maybe it's to rest. Growth doesn't always mean doing more. Sometimes it means removing what keeps damaging you. You begin choosing based on values instead of reactions. You stop making decisions just to impress people or prove them wrong. That's important because building your life around proving someone else wrong still means they're controlling the direction. Imagine spending years becoming successful purely because someone told you that you couldn't. You may achieve the goal, but eventually you'll ask, what did I actually want? Don't let someone else's doubt become your entire motivation. Use it if it wakes you up, but don't let it define the destination. Your life needs a deeper reason. Build because you value what you're creating. Learn because you enjoy becoming capable. Improve because you respect your potential. Protect your peace because you understand its value. And if people don't understand your choices, that's okay. Not everyone needs a detailed explanation. Some people will only understand after they see the results. Others may never understand. You can survive both. The important thing is that you remain honest with yourself. Don't become so focused on proving everyone wrong that you forget to become right for yourself. And don't become so obsessed with being different that you reject good advice, simply because it came from someone else. Independence isn't refusing every suggestion. It's being able to listen without surrendering your judgment.